settles in, a feeling that they are not alone. This is Japan's haunted heart, a place where the past refuses to rest, and where every shadow could hold a hidden presence. Tonight, we unravel 10 chilling stories, each rooted in truth, each more unsettling than the last. These are stories told in hushed tones, tales of encounters that defy explanation, stories of cursed forests, abandoned tunnels, and restless spirits that haunt the living. Some of these places are infamous, like the Aokigahara Forest, a place where despair has left its mark. Others are lesser known, but no less terrifying. Each tale carries with it the weight of those who lived it, and the lingering fear of what might still linger there today. Before we begin, let me ask you this. How brave are you? Will you dare to listen to these stories alone in the dark? Or will you turn away when the shadows seem to move and the whispers grow louder? Tonight, you'll decide if you believe in the unseen, the unexplained, and the truly terrifying. Welcome to tonight's journey into the haunted corners of Japan. We've collected 10 stories that delve into the mysteries of this ancient land, perfect for those seeking a dose of fear before drifting into uneasy dreams. These accounts are inspired by true events, drawn from local legends, eyewitness reports, and places said to be cursed. Before we begin, tell us, which of these stories will chill you the most? Do you know of a tale we've missed? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more haunting tales from around the world. Now, let us begin with our first tale, a story of loss, regret, and the spirits said to linger in the infamous Sea of Trees. Began on an autumn evening, when the fading light of day was swallowed by the encroaching mist, and with that, the spirits awoke. Kenji's arrival at the ryokan seemed like the beginning of a perfect escape. Tired from weeks of travel, he arrived at the inn just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with the faintest blush of twilight. The road leading to the ryokan was narrow and winding, veiled by thick trees that blocked the light, creating an almost unnatural darkness. The ryokan's silhouette loomed at the end of the road, a wooden structure that seemed as old as time itself, its dark windows glowing faintly under the warm light of lanterns. The innkeeper, a woman with deeply etched wrinkles around her eyes and a quiet, almost mournful expression, greeted him at the door. Her hands were cold to the touch as she handed him the key to his room, her voice soft yet firm. "Room number 5, she told him, almost as though she had said it 1,000 times before. Kenji, eager to unwind, followed her through the dimly lit hallways. The floors creaked underfoot, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty corridors. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease that clung to the air, but it was hard to ignore the silence that seemed to surround him, as though the very walls were holding their breath. It's an old building, he thought, trying to comfort himself. Everything creaks in places like this. That night, after a bath in the ryokan's steaming hot spring, Kenji retired to his room. It was as traditional as one could imagine. Tatami mats on the floor, sliding paper doors, and a simple futon rolled out on the floor. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warm glow casting shadows on the walls. But despite the comfort of the room, Kenji couldn't shake the eerie feeling that followed him. The air felt dense, thick with a presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He dismissed it as exhaustion, telling himself that it was the stress of travel catching up with him. But then, as the night deepened and the wind howled outside, something changed. Kenji was lying on his futon, his body sore from the journey, when he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside his room. At first, he thought it was the innkeeper or another guest passing by. But the footsteps were slow, measured, almost deliberate, as though someone were pacing up and down the hall. Kenji's heart began to race, and he strained his ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It grew louder, closer. He could almost hear the soft rustle of someone's clothing and the faint shuffle of slippers across the wooden floor. Kenji sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at the paper door that separated him from the hallway, half expecting to see a shadow shift beneath the crack. But there was nothing. The footsteps continued, moving further down the hall before fading into silence. Kenji waited, the seconds stretching into minutes, before he finally dared to get up and peer outside. He slid the paper door open quietly, his breath shallow with fear. The hallway outside was empty, no one in sight. The silence was almost deafening now, the only sound the faint whisper of the wind against the paper windows. He stepped out, the cool floorboards creaking underfoot, and moved cautiously down the hall. But the strange sensation of being watched didn't fade. It intensified, like an invisible presence just out of reach. The footsteps had stopped, but they lingered in his mind, echoing in his ears as if they were still there, just beyond the veil. Kenji returned to his room, heart still racing. He tried to calm himself, telling himself that it was just the building settling. But as he looked around, he noticed something strange. Across from his futon, where there had been no mirror earlier, was now a large, full-length mirror. It stood against the wall, its dark frame ornate, with intricate carvings that seemed to shift in the dim light. Kenji couldn't remember it being there when he first arrived, its face obscured by a dark veil. Kenji spun around, his heart racing, but the room was empty. No one was there. Yet, the figure in the mirror had not disappeared. It had stepped forward, its face now visible. The reflection showed a woman, her eyes hollow, her lips drawn back in a faint ghostly smile. Her hair hung in black strands, her features pale and sharp, as though she had not seen the light of day in years. Kenji gasped and stumbled backward, knocking into the edge of the table. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the mirror, unable to look away. The woman in the reflection did not speak. She simply smiled, her smile widening as if she were delighted by his fear. His mind raced, his pulse quickening. Was this some sort of illusion? Was he hallucinating from exhaustion? But the woman's gaze was too real, too chilling. Kenji reached out a trembling hand toward the mirror, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. The moment he touched it, a sharp, searing pain shot through his hand, as though he had been burned by ice. He pulled his hand away, his heart pounding in his chest. The woman in the mirror continued to watch him, her smile never faltering. Unable to bear it any longer, Kenji turned and bolted from the room, slamming the paper door behind him. He raced down the hallway, his breath ragged, his body trembling. The footsteps were back, following him now, louder than ever. He stumbled toward the front door, desperate to escape. But as he reached for the handle, it didn't open. He pulled harder, but the door was stuck. Panicked, he glanced back down the hallway. The woman in the mirror was standing at the far end of the corridor, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "You shouldn't have looked," she whispered, her voice like a cold wind against his skin. Kenji turned, scrambling to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if the inn itself were holding him in, trapping him inside. The footsteps were now all around him, echoing from every direction. He backed away, his mind in chaos, until he felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. That's when he saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing just behind the innkeeper, who had appeared in the doorway. The innkeeper's expression was distant, as though she didn't recognize him at all. Then, in a soft voice, she spoke. "I warned you. You shouldn't have stayed." Kenji fled into the night, not stopping until he was miles away from the ryokan. The wind howled in his ears, the whispers of the woman and the footsteps following him, chasing him even as he ran. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, he looked back toward the mountains, and in the distance he could see the faint light of the ryokan, flickering like a dying flame. Kenji never returned to that inn. The image of the woman, the reflection that wasn't his, haunted him for years to come. He never spoke of what happened that night, not even to his closest friends. But he couldn't forget. The spirits of that ryokan had touched him, and he knew, deep down, that he would never truly escape their grasp. Have you ever stayed at a place that gave you the feeling you were not alone? Perhaps there was something in the mirror, or a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Do you believe in the spirits that haunt old buildings? Or is it just your mind playing tricks on you? Let me know in the comments. Have you ever experienced something that made you question what's real? The haunted ryokan continues to stand, silent and waiting. If you ever find yourself traveling through the mountains of Japan, take care where you choose to rest. For some places hold more than just memories. They hold spirits, restless and watching, waiting for the next guest to enter. Kai, Haruto, and Mei. A night where a seemingly innocent road trip turned into a haunting journey they would never forget. The road trip began like any other. A group of young friends setting off on a long weekend getaway. Their car packed with snacks, music, and laughter. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the winding mountain roads. Emily, the driver, was excited, her hands steady on the wheel as they made their way through a picturesque valley, passing through villages that seemed frozen in time. Haruto, the most adventurous of the group, was perched in the passenger seat, his head out the window, soaking in the mountain breeze. Kai and Mei, the quieter members of the group, sat in the back, content with the view and chatting softly. They had heard about the Whispering Tunnel before. Locals always gave the same warning when the subject came up. Never go through it at night. But it was just a story, right? A superstition. Nothing more than a spooky tale passed down from generation to generation. "It's just a tunnel," Kai had joked earlier. "What's the worst that could happen?" Mei had agreed, adding, "Besides, we'll be out of it in no time, and we'll be laughing about it later." The words, light-hearted at the time, seemed to mock the eerie reputation of the place. But as they neared the tunnel's entrance, something felt different. The air grew colder. The wind picked up. The sky overhead, once painted with a soft orange hue, seemed to darken unnaturally fast. As they approached the tunnel, Emily slowed the car. The road was narrow, the walls of rock rising sharply on either side, and the tunnel's entrance was almost entirely hidden by the overgrown trees that clung to the mountain's edge. The opening looked like the mouth of some forgotten creature, waiting to swallow them whole. The others fell silent as they neared it, and for a brief moment, the only sound was the engine's hum and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. "This is it," Emily said, her voice a bit too loud in the sudden stillness. The others exchanged uneasy glances. Mei, the most intuitive of them all, felt a shiver run down her spine. She had heard the stories from her grandmother, about the voices that called out to travelers at night, the spirits that wandered the tunnel's darkness, and how the sound of whispers always echoed louder as you got closer. Her grandmother had never told her why those spirits haunted the tunnel, only that they were never to be disturbed. But it was too late for second thoughts. Emily pressed the gas pedal, and the car began to roll into the tunnel. As the car entered the darkness, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The headlights sliced through the blackness ahead, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls of the tunnel. The noise of the car's engine seemed to fade, replaced by the unsettling sound of the wind echoing off the tunnel's jagged stone walls. At first, it was just the sound of the tires rolling over the uneven pavement. But then, just as they were halfway through, the faintest sound began to creep into the air. A soft whisper, barely audible, almost as if carried on the wind. At first, no one said anything, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until it was impossible to ignore. "Did you hear that?" Kai asked, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes wide as he looked around. "What was that?" May said, her voice trembling slightly. She had heard it too. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around them, like hundreds of voices, each one calling out a name. But it was not clear who the voices belonged to. It wasn't any of their names, not at first. The whispers, soft and slithering, coiled around them, making the air feel heavy. They seemed to pull at their thoughts, beckoning them further into the blackness. Kai looked at Haruto, who seemed unaffected. "I'm sure it's just the wind," Haruto said, trying to sound convincing, but his voice was shaky, as if even he wasn't entirely sure. But the whispers didn't stop. They were clearer now, too clear. And they weren't just voices in the wind, her shoulder, as if she could feel something behind them. Then, in the darkness, the whispers began again, this time much louder, and they were unmistakably calling their names. Emily, Kai, May, Haruto. The voices hissed, their tone growing more urgent, as though they were beckoning them to stay, to listen. The voices came from all directions, but none of them seemed to belong to anyone in the car. "Did you hear that?" Haruto said, his face pale. He was now leaning forward, staring into the rearview mirror, his eyes wide in terror. "What? What is it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling, turning to look at him. Haruto's hand was shaking as he pointed at the rearview mirror. At first, it was just the darkness. But then, slowly, something began to emerge from the shadows behind them. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing in the middle of the tunnel, just out of reach of the faint light from the car's dashboard. The figure had no face, only a void where its eyes should have been. It seemed to hover, shifting in and out of view as if it wasn't entirely real. "No," May whispered, clutching her arms tightly. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here now." But before anyone could move, the figure in the rearview mirror began to move toward them, its shadowy form stretching and distorting unnaturally, growing larger with each passing second. "What is it? Who is it?" Kai asked, his voice barely a whisper. But before anyone could answer, the figure vanished from the mirror, disappearing into the blackness. "What the hell just happened?" Emily gasped, her breath ragged, her body trembling. "Did anyone see that?" May said, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide with terror. It was right there. It was behind us. Emily turned around in her seat, her heart racing, but there was nothing. The tunnel was still and empty, no figure in sight. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, louder now, as though something was right behind them, watching them, waiting for them to listen. "Let's go," Emily said, her voice tight with fear. "I can't take this anymore." She turned the ignition again, her hands shaking, and miraculously, the car started. The headlights flickered back to life, casting long shadows on the walls of the tunnel. Without saying another word, Emily slammed her foot on the gas pedal, and the car shot forward, racing through the tunnel as fast as it could. The whispers faded behind them, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. It felt as though something was still following them, lingering in the shadows of the road they had just left behind. Have you ever found yourself trapped in a place where the darkness seemed to have a mind of its own? What would you do if you heard voices in the night calling your name with no one in sight? Have you experienced something like this? Let us know in the comments, and remember, some roads, no matter how familiar they may seem, lead to places we can never fully escape from. The Whispering Tunnel still stands, hidden deep in the mountains, waiting for the next traveler to cross its threshold. Who knows how many others have heard the whispers, felt the chill of its shadows? It's a place that haunts the living and the dead alike, a place where reality bends and spirits linger. If you ever find yourself on a road like this, remember the warning. Not all stories are just stories. Some are warnings. A curse that follows them even after they leave. Deep in the forests of Hokkaido, where the world is blanketed in snow and the only sounds are the whispers of the wind through the pines, there stands an old, crumbling shrine. It has been long forgotten by most, tucked away from the well-worn paths of tourists and hikers, but those who still know of its existence speak of it in hushed tones. The shrine is home to something far more unsettling than the typical relics of a distant past: a doll. The doll is kept in a small, dimly lit chamber within the shrine, surrounded by faded offerings and the smell of incense long burned out. It is an oddity, a small, porcelain figure of a woman dressed in tattered traditional robes, her eyes lifeless and cold. What makes this doll so frightening, however, is its hair, real human hair. It is long, unnaturally silky, and unlike any wig or fake hair used for doll making. It grows, and over time, it has become an object of both reverence and terror. Locals have long warned that this doll is cursed, that anyone who dares to disrespect it or disturb its resting place will suffer misfortune, illness, nightmares, and an overwhelming sense of dread. But no one truly knows the origin of the doll, and no one has ever dared to speak its full name aloud, for fear of calling forth its wrath. One autumn afternoon, a group of 3 travelers from Tokyo, Takashi, a skeptic, Ayumi, a spiritual enthusiast, and Hiroshi, a thrill-seeker, set out on a hiking trip through Hokkaido's wilderness. They had heard the rumors about the shrine and, intrigued by the possibility of uncovering something mysterious, decided to visit it. Takashi, ever the rationalist, was unconvinced by the supernatural stories surrounding the doll. He believed it was just a local legend, a way for the villagers to attract attention to their fading shrine. "There's no such thing as curses," Takashi had laughed when Ayumi had expressed hesitation about entering the shrine. "This is just superstition, a relic of old beliefs that people hold on to out of fear." Ayumi had remained silent, though her unease was clear. Hiroshi, on the other hand, was more intrigued by the thrill of exploring such a forgotten, mysterious place. The 3 friends arrived at the shrine as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The air was cold and still, and the old wooden shrine appeared even more weathered than Takashi had imagined. The door creaked loudly as they entered, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Inside, the faint smell of incense lingered, and they found themselves face to face with the doll. It sat in a small glass case, its porcelain face as still as the surrounding air, its black eyes seeming to stare into the very souls of those who dared to look. Ayumi, who had been wary of this place from the start, crossed herself and muttered a prayer under her breath, urging her friends to leave. But Takashi scoffed at her reaction. "It's just a doll," Takashi said, stepping closer. "What's the worst that could happen?" His voice was dismissive, and he reached out to tap the glass case, as if to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. The instant his fingers made contact, a strange chill swept through the room, and the hair on the doll's head seemed to move ever so slightly. Ayumi gasped and took a step back, but Takashi laughed, his bravado masking his growing unease. "See? Nothing. It's just a story," Takashi muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. But as he turned to walk away, he felt something strange, a sensation as if he were being watched. He turned to glance over his shoulder at the doll, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw its eyes blink. He froze, staring at the doll in disbelief, but when he looked again, its eyes were still, as they had always been. The trio left the shrine that evening, the unease lingering like a heavy fog. Ayumi, disturbed by the events inside, had insisted they leave quickly, but Takashi had laughed it off. "There's nothing here. It's all in your head." He said this to reassure both Ayumi and himself, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As he tried to calm himself, he saw something in the corner of his eye, a figure standing in the darkness of the room. He squinted, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, but Takashi knew deep down who it was: the doll. Somehow, the doll's presence had followed him into the room, and its gaze was fixed firmly on him. His heart raced in panic, and he rushed to turn on the lights, but when the room flooded with light, the figure was gone, vanished without a trace. But the scratches on his arms remained, raw and bleeding, as though the doll's unseen hands had left their mark. Takashi's nights became a blur of restless sleep and terrifying dreams. He would close his eyes, only to find himself back in the shrine, staring into the doll's unblinking eyes. Every time he blinked, its gaze seemed to move, following him wherever he went. The whispers, too, started to fill his dreams. Low, guttural voices, calling his name, warning him to stay away from the cursed doll. But the worst of it was the feeling of the doll watching him, its presence so real that he could almost feel its cold porcelain against his skin. And every morning, he would wake up to find new scratches on his body, deep, jagged marks that never seemed to heal, no matter how hard he tried. Hiroshi and Ayumi noticed his growing distress, but dismissed it as stress from the trip. "Maybe you're just tired," Hiroshi said, offering Takashi a drink. "You've been through a lot." But Ayumi could see it in Takashi's eyes. She could see that he wasn't the same person anymore. On their final day in Hokkaido, Takashi made one last trip to the shrine. He had to see it, to understand why this was happening. When he arrived, the shrine seemed even more desolate than before, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the doll waited, still as ever, in its glass case. Takashi stepped closer, his body trembling, and for the first time, he reached out to touch it again. But before his fingers could make contact, the glass shattered, sending jagged shards scattering across the floor. And that's when he saw it. The doll's eyes blinked, slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging his presence for the first time. Takashi stumbled backward, his heart racing. And the last thing he heard before everything went black was the low whisper of a voice just behind him, echoing through the shrine. Have you ever felt like something was watching you? Something that shouldn't be there? The cursed doll of Hokkaido continues to haunt the people who dare to challenge it. Would you dare to go near such a relic, knowing the curse that awaits? Share your thoughts, and let us know if you've ever experienced anything like this in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones that seem the most innocent. The cursed doll of Hokkaido still sits in its shrine, waiting for the next visitor brave or foolish enough to test its power. Some say that the doll's curse is never truly lifted, and that its gaze follows those who dare to disrespect it, leaving them marked for life. So, if you ever find yourself wandering the snowy forests of Hokkaido, be sure to keep your distance from the shrine, because sometimes the past never stays buried, and some curses can never be escaped. Nagging thought that they are not alone. But for one hiker, this place would hold more than just an unsettling atmosphere. It would reveal a ghost, a woman whose tragic story is forever intertwined with the dark legacy of Aokigahara. The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon as Yuki, a seasoned hiker from Tokyo, arrived at the edge of Aokigahara Forest. The day had been long, filled with hiking trails that wound through the forest's eerie calm. The air was heavy, not with the typical humidity one might expect in Japan's woods, but with an oppressive stillness, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Yuki had heard the legends of the forest, the stories of lost souls and wandering spirits, but he was no stranger to nature's more unsettling side. He had hiked in many places, from the quiet mountains of northern Japan to the dense woodlands of Hokkaido. But something about Aokigahara felt different, something that made his pulse quicken, though he couldn't put his finger on why. "I'll stay for a few more hours, at least," Yuki muttered to himself, taking another deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air. He had always been drawn to the mysterious, to the places that others feared to tread. But as he ventured deeper into the forest, the path became less clear, and the light began to fade. The forest had a strange quality to it, like a place suspended in time, where nothing changed and nothing moved. The trees were thick and packed so closely together that they blocked out much of the fading daylight. Yuki was beginning to feel the weight of the silence that pressed down on him like a physical presence. As Yuki trudged forward, the hairs on the back of his neck began to stand on end. The faintest sound seemed to stir the air, something he couldn't quite identify. A distant cry, muffled by the trees. His pace slowed, and he paused to listen more carefully. "It's probably just the wind," Yuki whispered to himself, trying to reassure himself as the sound grew louder. A high-pitched wail that echoed through the trees. It was not an animal's cry, nor the rustling of the forest. No, it was distinctly human, filled with sorrow and despair, yet oddly distant, as though it was coming from somewhere deep within the heart of the forest. He hesitated. The thought of turning back crossed his mind, but his curiosity got the better of him. The cries continued, and he followed them deeper into the woods, as though some unseen force was pulling him forward. And then, just as he rounded a corner between two towering trees, he saw her, standing by a large boulder, her back to him. A woman in a long, flowing white dress, her hair long and disheveled, her face obscured by the dark shadows of the forest. She was standing still, as if unaware of his presence, her hands hanging limply at her sides. Yuki froze in place, his heart racing. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The woman was eerily still, but the cries, those heart-wrenching, mournful cries, were coming from her, or at least from somewhere near her. It was as if the air itself was charged with sorrow. Tentatively, Yuki took a step forward, his footfall barely making a sound on the thick layer of leaves covering the ground. He felt the strange compulsion to approach her, to speak to her, though something deep inside him told him to turn around and leave. But before he could take another step, the woman turned her head, slowly, as if moving against some unseen force. Yuki's breath caught in his throat as he met her gaze. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to look through him rather than at him. Her face was gaunt, pale, and twisted in a grotesque expression of sadness. For a moment, Yuki was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. He could feel the air growing colder, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The woman's mouth opened, but the cries had stopped. In their place was a soft, whispering voice, barely audible over the wind. "Why do you come here?" she asked, her voice trembling as if it had been lost in the depths of time. "Why do you walk these cursed paths, knowing that the souls of the lost never leave?" Object half buried in the leaves. He knelt down and brushed away the dirt, revealing an old photograph. The edges were curled and the image was faded, but it was still recognizable. It was a family, 2 parents and 2 children, standing together in front of a shrine. The parents looked joyful, smiling for the camera, but the children's faces were pale, and their expressions were twisted with sorrow. As Yuki stared at the photograph, he felt the weight of the forest pressing in on him, the cold seeping deeper into his bones. And then, in the corner of the photograph, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The same woman. She was there, standing beside the family, but she looked different. Her face was full of life, her eyes full of hope. But it was clear now, this was no ordinary woman. Yuki's mind raced. Who was she? Why was she here? Why had she appeared to him? In his panic, he scrambled to his feet and turned to leave, the photograph still clutched in his hand. But as he moved away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest seemed to close in around him, and the faint whispers began again, this time louder, more frantic. "Leave. Leave now, before it's too late." The voice echoed, and Yuki turned to find himself standing alone once more. The forest was empty, silent, and still, as if the ghostly encounter had never happened. When Yuki returned to Tokyo, the photograph remained tucked in his bag, a haunting reminder of what he had seen in the forest. He showed it to no one, but the memory of the woman's hollow eyes and the cries that echoed in the trees continued to plague him, haunting his dreams. He could never shake the feeling that he had been marked, cursed, perhaps, by the spirit of Aokigahara. And in the years that followed, Yuki would often find himself standing at the edge of a forest or staring at an old photograph, his heart pounding with the memory of that fateful encounter. What do you think Yuki saw in Aokigahara? Was it truly the spirit of a lost soul? Or is there something darker lurking in the shadows of the suicide forest? Have you ever experienced something that made you question what's real? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. And if you've ever felt the pull of a haunted place, you're not alone. The ghost of Aokigahara still haunts the forest, forever tied to the tragic history of those who have come to the forest to end their lives. The cries of the lost souls echo in the silence, and the forest itself seems to swallow anyone who dares to tread too far in. Some say that if you listen closely enough, you can still hear her voice, calling out to those who venture too deep. And perhaps Yuki's encounter was not a warning, but a curse he will carry for the rest of his days. Pay homage to the fallen samurai who fought in the bloody conflict that had ravaged the land hundreds of years ago. The battlefield was wide, bordered by tall grasses and old stone markers that had been weathered by time. In the distance, an ancient torii gate stood, marking the entryway to a shrine that had been erected to honor the souls of the warriors who died here. Kenji had always been fascinated by samurai history. He had read countless books on the subject, seen all the films, and studied the ancient techniques of the martial art, but he never expected to experience the full weight of the samurai's legacy in the way he would that day. As he walked the battlefield, the air seemed to thicken with the presence of something unseen. It was as if the land itself still remembered the bloodshed, the pain, the cries of the warriors who had died on that soil. Kenji wandered deeper into the battlefield, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots the only sound that accompanied him. As he passed through the rows of markers, he felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. The place, though quiet and beautiful, seemed to pulse with an energy that was impossible to ignore. He paused to take a photograph of an old samurai helmet displayed in a small shrine, its metal surface dulled with age, but still regal in its design. As he snapped the picture, the wind picked up suddenly, rustling the trees with an eerie, almost unnatural force. Kenji shivered, but thought little of it. After all, he was in a forest, and the wind was a natural occurrence. But then something strange happened, something he could not explain. The unmistakable sound of metal clanging filled the air. At first, it was faint, distant, as though it were a memory echoing through the ages. But the sounds grew louder, sharper, like swords clashing in battle. Kenji's heart skipped a beat. He turned around quickly, his eyes scanning the battlefield. There, in the distance, he could just make out the silhouette of what appeared to be a figure, clad in ancient armor, holding a sword aloft, poised as if preparing for battle. The wind howled around him now, and Kenji's breath came in shallow gasps. His legs felt heavy, his feet rooted to the ground as he watched the figure move. The sound of clashing swords echoed through the battlefield, followed by the unmistakable roar of war cries. Kenji's mind raced. Was this some kind of historical reenactment? He looked around for others, but he was completely alone. As the figure drew closer, Kenji could see it more clearly. He was no longer looking at a reenactor, but at a ghostly warrior, his armor battered and stained with the blood of battle. The samurai's face was obscured by a menacing mask, but his eyes, those eyes, burned with a fury and pain that sent a chill down Kenji's spine. Kenji's feet felt like lead, his body frozen in place. He tried to speak, to call out, but no words came. It was as if the very air had thickened, silencing him. The samurai raised his sword, and in that moment, Kenji could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, the heavy tread of more warriors moving through the grass. Were they real? Or were they merely figments of his imagination? The samurai's hand suddenly shot out, pointing directly at Kenji. It was a gesture filled with fury and accusation, like a curse being laid upon him. Kenji stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The warrior's gaze never left him, and as Kenji turned to flee, the sounds of battle grew louder, more chaotic, until they were deafening. The samurai's figure remained fixed in place, pointing at him with an unyielding focus, as if he had been marked for something. A fate Kenji could not escape. Kenji turned and ran, his breath ragged in his chest, his pulse racing. His feet barely touched the ground as he sprinted away from the battlefield, the clanging of swords echoing in his ears, the cries of warriors filling his head. He could feel the weight of the curse upon him, the cold breath of the samurai on his neck, the pressure of his accusing finger as if it was still pressing into his soul. The curse, Kenji realized, was not something he could outrun. It had followed him, and it would continue to follow him, just as the samurai's spirit had been bound to this land. In the days that followed, Kenji couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Everywhere he went, he felt as though someone or something was lurking just out of sight. Strange things began to happen around him. Objects would shift positions when he wasn't looking. Whispers would fill the air when no one was around. And every night, he would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he could still hear the clashing of swords in the distance. He visited the memorial again, hoping to find answers. But the moment he set foot on the battlefield, the overwhelming sense of dread returned. The war cries echoed in his ears, and he could feel the presence of the samurai's spirit, cold, unforgiving, and relentless. It was then that Kenji learned of the curse that had haunted the battlefield for centuries. A curse placed upon the land by a dying samurai who had been betrayed by his own comrades. In his final moments, he had sworn vengeance on those who had wronged him, vowing that no one who set foot on the battlefield would ever escape without bearing the mark of his fury. Kenji had unwittingly become the latest victim of the samurai's curse. The warrior had pointed at him, and in doing so, he had marked him for something far darker than mere death. The curse would follow him, torment him, until he was either driven to madness or forced to confront the wrath of the samurai's spirit. What do you think happened to Kenji? Was he truly cursed by the spirit of the samurai? Or did his mind simply break under the weight of the battle's history? Have you ever visited a place where the past seemed to reach out and grab hold of you? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And remember, some curses are not bound by time. They follow you wherever you go. The samurai's curse is a reminder that the spirits of the past are not so easily laid to rest. The warrior's rage, his betrayal, and his thirst for vengeance live on, trapped in the land where he fell. And for those who walk upon that cursed battlefield, the consequences are more than just historical, they are personal, and they last for eternity.